Welcome to Parliament Through Time podcast. I hope you are all well and safe. This podcast is about the origins, development and current practices of the institution of Parliament in Europe and the Middle East. Each week we will deliver an overview of certain key topics to enhance our understanding of parliamentary life, what lessons we have learned from the past events, and how these lessons learned can be applied to today's practices. Last week, we analysed the parliamentary development in the Middle East and North Africa after the Arab Spring. This week, we will discuss the parliamentary activity in the times of crisis and how the parliaments could secure checks and balances in emergency situations. Recent experience with coronavirus directly points to the importance of the parliaments to find a proper role in addressing an emergency situation. The podcast series is produced by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy in the framework of the European Union-supported Jordanian House of Representatives programme. Marko Vujacic, the committees and oversight expert in the programme, prepared the content of the podcast. I am Lamasawi, your host for this podcast from the heart of Amman, Jordan. On the 31st of December 2019, Country Office of the World Health Organization in the People's Republic of China picked up a media statement by the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission from their website on cases of viral pneumonia in Wuhan and requested more information from China. On the 3rd of January 2020, Chinese officials provided information to WHO on the cluster of cases of viral pneumonia of unknown cause identified in Wuhan. On the 9th of January 2020, WHO reported that Chinese authorities have determined that the outbreak is caused by a novel coronavirus. Within few weeks, on the 30th of January 2020, the WHO declared the coronavirus outbreak a public health emergency of international concern. And on the 11th of March 2020, the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, was declared a pandemic. Since then, it has spread to most corners of the globe. While the health threat it poses for human health is paramount, no less important is the strain it puts on the legal order. For most of the affected countries, the pandemic imposed unprecedented institutional challenges and has obliged institutions and governments to adopt strict measures affecting citizens' rights in a way unparalleled since the Second World War. In his article No Quarantine for Democracy, Belgian parliamentary expert Franklin de Vriezer counted that over 100 countries have passed emergency laws or declared states of emergency in response to the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, while maybe justified on healthcare grounds, could impose a serious risk of creating an unintentional wave of authoritarianism by curtailing civil liberties on a massive scale. In the report of the European Parliamentary Research Service titled States of Emergency in Response to the Coronavirus Crisis, situation in certain member states have adopted a range of emergency measures in response to the unprecedented public health crisis generated by the coronavirus pandemic. Whereas not all EU member states disposed of constitutional mechanisms to enable the declaration of a state of emergency, all have taken exceptional and far-reaching emergency measures that affect citizens' rights and freedoms as well as democratic process. Authors also warned these institutional changes and the restrictions imposed on citizens' lives pose significant institutional and democratic challenges. Given their impact on fundamental rights and freedoms on the normal functioning of democracy, the European Convention on Human Rights and constitutional orders in most of European countries require that emergency measures need to be carefully examined, matched with adequate legal safeguards and subject to democratic parliamentary scrutiny. So, how did some parliaments go about it? The Belgian Constitution of 1831 has no specific provisions dedicated to the state of emergency. On the contrary, Article 187 of the Constitution clearly states that the Constitution cannot be suspended in whole nor in part. Nevertheless, under the Article 105 Special Powers Mechanism, allows the Belgian Parliament to delegate legislative powers to the government. With the pandemic looming, two laws were adopted on the 27th of March 2020 to enable the Belgian government to adopt measures to control the spread of COVID-19 for a maximum period of 3 months, starting on the day the laws entered into force, which was the 30th of March. Throughout this time, the Belgian House of Representatives preserved control over emergency measures. Under the special powers provision, decrees need to be confirmed by law within a set deadline. In the specific case of a pandemic, the decrees need to be confirmed within a year of their entry into force. In the absence of such confirmation, they will become void. Moreover, in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, the Belgian House of Representatives has created a new parliamentary committee devoted specifically to requesting information from and overseeing the members of the federal government with regard to measures taken under the special powers provision. In Spain, under Article 116 of the Constitution of 1978 and the Organic Law from 1981, it is possible to declare 3 different states of emergency, namely a state of alarm, a state of emergency, and a state of siege, which is the martial law. The state of alarm can be declared for a maximum period of 15 days by the national government, immediately informing the lower house of the Cortes Generales Congress of Deputies. However, the extension of the state of alarm beyond 15 days is subject to authorization by the lower house. The state of emergency and the state of siege have never yet been declared. The state of emergency can be declared by the government with prior authorization of the Congress of Deputies for a maximum period of 30 days. That can be extended for another 30 days following the same procedure. It can be declared in case of serious public disorder, other events affecting the free exercise of fundamental citizens' rights, the normal functioning of democratic institutions or essential public services. The state of siege has to be declared by an absolute majority of the members of the Congress of Deputies, 176 out of 350, on a proposal presented by the government, and it can be only declared if a violent uprising or some other act of force endangers Spanish sovereignty or independence, the territorial integrity of Spain, or the Spanish constitutional order. The Spanish government addressed the situation caused by the coronavirus pandemic by declaring a state of alarm on the 14th of March 2020. It was prolonged for the first time on the 27th of March until the 12th of April, for the second time on the 10th of April until the 26th of April, for the third time on the 24th of April until the 9th of May. Before the declaration of the state of alarm, most Spanish regions had already adopted measures to address the situation, in example, closing schools, cancelling cultural, educational or sporting activities, etc. The Congress of Deputies played an important role in overseeing the measures adopted by the government under the state of alarm. At the outbreak of the pandemic, the Congress was informed of the declaration of the state alarm on the 16th of March, and a plenary session in which the Prime Minister explained the situation took place on 18th of March. The 3 extensions of the state of alarm were also authorized by the Congress and plenary sessions held on the 25th of March, 9th of April and 22nd of April. As the Congress also controls how the government exercises its competence to adopt decree laws, it is important to note that the Chamber was debating and decided to confirm 7 decree laws adopted during the pandemic, and to transform some of them into law. The parliamentary sessions went ahead with minimal attendance of members on the House premises, and making use of the remote electronic voting system used by the Chamber since 2012. More than 300 members voted remotely in all plenary sessions. In Romania, the President of the Republic can declare a state of siege or a state of emergency for the entire country, or for certain territorial units, and then ask the Parliament for its approval within 5 days. If the Parliament is not in session, it must be convened by law no later than 48 hours after the declaration of the state of emergency, and it must remain in session throughout the period. Moreover, the parliament cannot be dissolved during the state of emergency or siege. On the 16th of March 2020, the Romanian president issued a decree proclaiming the state of emergency throughout the territory of the country for an initial period of 30 days. It was the first time such powers were used since the adoption of Constitution in 1991. The state of emergency was prolonged for an additional 30 days by decree of the 14th of April 2020. On the 19th of March, the Parliament of Romania approved the decree imposing the state of emergency unconditionally. The decree extending the state of emergency was debated more thoroughly in the Parliament and was approved after imposing a number of safeguards. The Parliament's decision approving the decree provided that restrictions on rights and freedoms during the state of emergency should only be based on law and should be strictly for the purpose of preventing and combating the pandemic. Moreover, the decision obliges the government to report weekly to Parliament on the measures adopted or envisaged for preventing and combating the pandemic. The government is also required to present a full report within 30 days of the end of the state of emergency. De Vries notes, however, that several countries have taken unprecedented measures to monitor citizens by tracking their movement through mobile phone data. The Hungarian Parliament, for example, relinquished almost completely its constitutional role and passed a law allowing the government to rule by decree. Under the law, the government could suspend existing laws, authorize penalties of up to 5 years imprisonment for spreading fake news, suspend parliamentary oversight, and permit only the Prime Minister to determine an end to these emergency measures. It is not unknown that the times of crisis pose clear risk that checks and balances are ignored, in the name of the efficiency of the executive power. Yet, it is exactly Parliament's constitutional duty, De Vries argues, to guarantee checks and balances. Nevertheless, in the case of the corona crisis, where the measures taken aim to decrease social contacts, disallow gatherings of large groups of people, implement social distancing, it was only logical and justified that parliamentary meetings and plenary chamber in many countries have been postponed or reduced. The questions for parliaments were looming on how to respect and contribute the fight against the pandemic, and still organize themselves to perform designated constitutional roles. How to change practices with a view to continue exercising legislative and oversight functions. How to organize remote committee work. How to initiate remote plenary sessions. Many parliaments did not envisage remote voting using technical equipment in their rules of procedure. The question was how to go around these provisions. Many parliaments responded by taking steps and innovative procedural measures to ensure continuation of parliamentary role. Introducing remote plenary sessions, Wales, Maldives, Montenegro, many other parliaments. Reducing attendance proportionally in agreement between political groups, Sweden, Ireland. Reducing quorum rules, German Bundestag. Change of rules of procedure to allow committees to meet remotely and participate in meetings through email, conference calls and digital conferencing, United Kingdom. Recording of remote sessions and posting the online or live broadcasting, United Kingdom. Appointing special epidemic committees to scrutinize government response to epidemic, New Zealand, US Congress. Refurbishing parliamentary plenary chamber by creating transparent individual compartments for MPs, Serbia. As noted above, the substance of parliamentary work has considerably shifted. We already mentioned the role of Parliament in approving emergency measures, as well as potential misuses of these parliamentary prerogatives in some countries. Part of the measures of many countries were the budgetary and financial aid packages and fiscal stimulus for those individuals, families, and sectors hit severely by lockdowns and closures. For parliaments, this also opened an issue on how to control the increased government borrowing and spending in corona times. Aware of the dangers of spiraling debt for global monetary stability in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the International Monetary Fund issued own conditions for financial support and recommendations for governments and parliaments to address governance of fresh funds and corruption vulnerabilities. IMF reaffirmed the need for the governments and parliaments to ensure transparency and accountability in their actions, and for the resources to be used for their intended purpose. Principles to follow are: 1. Emergency assistance is used for the very urgent purpose of resolving the current crisis and not diverted for other purposes. 2. Enhanced reporting of crisis-related spending. 3. Undertaking and publishing independent ex-post audits of crisis-related spending. 4. Ensuring procurement transparency by publishing contracts and ownership information of firms awarded procurement contracts. In Canada, the Parliament adopted emergency legislation to respond to the pandemic and to assist millions of Canadians who have lost their livelihoods. Government and opposition have agreed a sunset clause to limit the government's ability to raise taxes without parliamentary approval. In addition, any spending under these measures will be scrutinized by the Public Accounts and Finance Committees and the Auditor General. The Finance Committee has also gained the ability to recall Parliament within 48 hours if anything fraudulent would be found. De Vries argues the corona crisis points to the importance that parliamentarians push for time-bound provisions within a law through inserting automatic end to the measures into the law. For instance, he continues, the Norwegian Parliament adopted an emergency act which is valid for 1 month and which can also be repealed at any given time. So, how can parliaments uphold a minimum of accountability for the emergency powers which they have granted to the executive? Best practices across different countries suggest that emergency legislation remains subject to debate and scrutiny in plenary or in committees. The technical quality of the legislative text is maintained. That there are minimum provisions regarding consulting concerned individuals, groups, experts, and affected organizations. That legislation remains proportionate in its response to the crisis, with possible introduction of automatic end-to measures. Tight scrutiny over the increased government borrowing and spending, and that fundamental constitutional rights are not permanently jeopardized. Only if these conditions and practices are met, parliaments can play a role that is constitutionally given to them, namely, to hold the executive to account in the times of crisis and emergencies. Being the less powerful branch in normal times, and especially in emergency times, with less expertise and instruments necessary to act, parliaments can only level up with executive by providing vigorous oversight of the measures executive takes. Failure to do so leads inevitably to public disengagement with democratic institutions and the decrease of trust in parliaments. You've listened to the 6th and the last episode of the podcast Parliaments Through Time, where we dealt with parliaments in crisis, checks and balances they should provide in emergency situations. Over the last 6 weeks, we took you to the journey through parliamentary history in Europe, Middle East, North Africa and the Gulf, issues pertaining to parliamentary development and contemporary issues and challenges that parliaments face. We hope we motivated you to explore more about the institution of Parliament, to connect with your MPs, to ask questions and to engage. We will continue producing content for you. Feel free to add comments and suggestions for future episodes on our social media where the podcast is shared. We will be happy to hear from you. On behalf of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy and the EU Jadid project team, we thank you for your attention. I was your host, Lamasawi, from the Heart of Oman. Stay tuned and stay safe.